Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me here, Elvira. It's really been a very lovely weekend. My wife and I have enjoyed meeting so many of you. This is a nice group of people. I must say, you guys are okay. With that as an introduction, and it also enabled me. I don't take this as an offense, but the biggest mistake I made in my clinical academic career was in taking French as a language rather than Spanish. I love French. I have an opportunity. I could read in the Hotel Dieu last night. I was able to read the descriptions in French, but other than that, I need to know Spanish because half of the patients at Columbia speak Spanish. But it's a beautiful language, and believe it or not, I actually took a course in Columbia College in romantic French poetry of the 19th century. I can quote you Baudelaire if you'd like, and you know, mon rêve familier, je fais souvent ce rêve étrange et pénétrant, etc. But well, with that as an introduction, I'm going to go to a far more somber topic. And so this is entitled How Physicians Partnered with the Nazi Regime, Possible Lessons for Today. I'm going to speak to you about what is probably the worst perversion of medical ethics in the history of mankind. The worst perversion, the worst desecration of the doctor-patient bond in the history of mankind. Is that relevant? Yes, it's relevant. Many of us are doctors, and it wasn't just doctors, it was nurses, it was other people in the medical profession. This didn't occur in ancient history. It did not occur in some pagan land. This occurred in the land with the greatest medicine, with the most elite physicians and so forth. Are there lessons? Yes, of course we have to learn from that. You know the famous statement, if we don't, those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it. I have no, excuse me, I have no declarations to make, no conflicts of interest. How did I get interested in this? I got interested in this because this organization, Medicine After the Holocaust, invited me and about 15 other bioethicists from the United States. Last in May of 2018, this was sponsored by this organization, Medicine After the Holocaust. It's based in Houston. It was formed by Dr. Sheldon Rubenfeld, who's a clinical professor of medicine at Baylor. And so we traveled to Berlin for about 5 days, and we visited various German sites in the vicinity of Berlin that were relevant to the medical crimes, and we were presented by German scholars about the role of the physicians during the Holocaust. And so I'm going to speak to you about the critical role. Now, you probably have all heard of the Holocaust, and you know about Auschwitz and so forth, and you may have heard about the fact that certain physicians like Dr. Mengele, the angel of death, condemned people to death, made selections, who shall live and who shall die. I knew this, and I have treated hundreds, literally hundreds of Holocaust survivors in my practice. But what I did not know was the extent of the medical establishment's involvement in general was huge. It was absolutely huge. And so I'm going to speak about the critical role of German physicians in the horrendous Nazi crimes against their own people, not just Jews and gypsies and homosexuals, and people of other nations. How could German medicine be perverted to this degree? So the key themes I'm going to say, number one, I want you to know after this talk the extent to which the medical establishment was involved, and B, how could this have happened? How could doctors have done this? The first question to answer is easier because it's factual. The second one is more conjectural. How could doctors do this? I will offer some possibilities of how they could have done it, but you may have different thoughts or say that that's not true, or other people may disagree with how doctors could have descended to those depths. The critical role that was played by the pseudoscience of eugenics in Nazi ideology and its American role model. The slippery slope concept. People say, oh no, slippery. There was a slippery slope. It started with forced sterilization of undesirables, of people with mental and physical disabilities. It led then to their murder, the euthanasia. It then led to the Holocaust, the wholesale mass murder of 6 million Jews, and possible lessons for today. So a couple of facts. The harvest of Nazi medicine during the Third Reich, these are just some facts. 400,000 German patients, that's fine, were sterilized, forcibly sterilized. 5,000 German kids were euthanized, children. 70,000 German adult patients euthanized. Notice this is German, German, German. We haven't gotten to the Jews yet. It started off with German citizens. About 50% of the patients in German mental hospitals at the start of World War II were allowed to die or forcibly killed. Cruel and murderous medical experiments, about 25,000 concentration camp inmates and others were subjected to horrible scientific experiments. And finally, 4.5 million Jews selected and gassed, in addition to the 1.5 million who were just shot, for a total of 6 million. And I think there was, this is attributed to Stalin, whether he said it or not, I don't know, but it's one of the truest things he ever said. A single death is a tragedy. 1 million deaths is a statistic. We can't conceive, we can't comprehend these numbers. We cannot. But in my practice, when I had a Holocaust survivor, and that person told me about what they went through and the death and extermination of their family, you get chills. You get tears. One person, 6 million, you sit there stone-faced. So these numbers really, it's hard for them to register. Now, German doctors were indispensable in the design and implementation of eugenocide, the killing of weak or defective people to improve the gene pool. This was the scientific basis for doing all this killing. Interestingly, a greater percentage of German physicians were members of the Nazi Party and the SS, which was the elite, the Schutzstaffel, the elite killers, than any other profession in Germany, more than lawyers, engineers, jurists, and so forth. By 1945, about 45% of all German doctors were in the Nazi Party, almost half, and 7% of doctors were members of the SS, compared to 0.5% of the general population. German medicine before and during National Socialism. I told you before, German medicine was the elite, the cream of the world, the best medicine in the world. At the turn of the 20th century, Germany was the world leader in medical research and practice. This is a quote from a wonderful book, if you want to go into this, Proctor's book, The Nazi War on Cancer, and he also wrote a book about racial hygiene. Racial hygiene is the book you want to read, actually. Nazism took root in the world's most powerful scientific culture, boasting half of the world's Nobel Prizes at that time, and a sizable fraction of the world's patents. German science and medicine were the envy of the world. Many leading American physicians went to Germany in the early 20th century for training. You may have, I don't know if you heard of the Flexner Report. American medicine prior to 1910 was basically anybody who wanted to start a medical school could. There was no scientific basis to it. There was a lot of fake medicine. And so in order to upgrade the quality of medicine, a Jewish guy, it happens to be Flexner, ironically, went to Europe, specifically in Germany, and he said, this is the way American medicine. We should model our medical schools after the Germans because they do it scientifically. This is the way to get good quality of medicine. And so this was the model. This was the model. How do you explain the transformation of physicians then from healers to killers? The best doctors, the best doctors. Physicians actively designed, administered, and carried out key elements of Nazi racial policy, such as forced sterilization, human experimentation, euthanasia, and mass killing. So I have to go a little bit into eugenics, because when you say, how could they do it, one of the key elements was it started off with eugenics. What is eugenics? This was, well, we'll go into that in a second. So I'm sorry, just some of the other points. There was eugenics. There was creation of the notion of life unworthy of life, a book that was written by a sophisticated physician and a lawyer about a concept of certain lives, lebenswerten Leben, lives that are not worthy of being lived. Number three, Germany suffered terribly following World War I. They lost 1.8 million soldiers, 4.2 million wounded. This had a tremendous impact about whether or not Germany should keep alive those who couldn't go and fight, the people with physical and mental disabilities. They were a drain on resources. So if the best of our youth were killed, why should we be keeping alive the lowest of our population? And that was a justification for killing them. They were useless eaters. That was the term that was used. The Versailles Treaty and staggering inflation and economic depression caused a great deal of suffering in Germany, and so the social matrix, the milieu, for coming up with extremist ideas was there. And there was an underlying German and Nazi racist and anti-Semitic ideology. It was not just Germany. France, definitely Poland, Eastern Europe, Russia, tremendous anti-Semitism, but they didn't have these other ingredients that I'm speaking to you now about. And finally, there was an economic incentive for doctors to displace the Jewish doctors. Jews were overrepresented in the medical profession, as they probably still are, in Germany. And so the Nazi doctors said, hey, to make a living, let's get rid of these guys. We'll take over their positions in academia, in their practices, and we can make a better living that way. So there was an economic incentive. Now, you all know this. There were Enlightenment ideals that were overthrown, things that we take for granted today. Declaration of Independence in the United States, all men created equal. Of course, it wasn't true. If you happened to be black, you could be a slave, etc. But nevertheless, at least it was written, and certainly it was an advance over what had occurred over the centuries before. People have inalienable rights. The French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and so forth, equality. And this is probably based on the Judeo-Christian tradition in Genesis, which actually Jews across the world read yesterday in Genesis. They just started to read the new cycle of the Torah, that God created the world and God creates man in his image, in the image of God. Not just Jews, not just whites, all men are created in the image of God. So these were the basic underlying principles. And then, beginning in the 19th century, you had people saying, no, not all men are created equal. So Arthur de Gobineau in 1853 writes an essay on the inequality of the human races, the whole notion of racism, that some races are more superior than others. The theory of the superiority of the Aryan white master race over the black and Asian races was propounded. People wrote books, academicians did. Aryans were felt to be superior because they possessed certain biological traits. Their DNA was superior to the DNA of other people. And the mixing of races was something to be avoided. This was unnatural, unscientific, and this would mongrelize the human race, and it would lead to their downfall and degradation. And then, of course, you had Darwin's Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, 1859, and you know, random selection, mutation, natural selection, and it worked well in nature. It produced the current species, which are felt to be superior to previous species because they can have traits that enable them to continue on. And then people said, you know what, if this worked for elephants and salamanders and for oak trees, it should work for people as well. And we should try, with social engineering and social Darwinism, we should try to improve the human species. And so we should have survival of the fittest. And when you have people with mental and physical disabilities, they are not the fittest. We should not work to perpetuate them and to have their inferior DNA perpetuated in their offspring. So social Darwinism, which arose after Darwin's theory, they applied these principles to individuals, and they said the same processes of natural selection that applies to plants and animals should be applied to human. We'll get a more superior human race. And they felt that governments should not interfere with this. So if you have Hôtel Dieu, which ministers to everybody, and people who are suffering, or people who have physical and mental disabilities, that's not good Hôtel Dieu. That is contrary to science. That is contrary to science. These people should be allowed to die so that we will end up with a more superior human race. In 1883, then, this pseudoscience of eugenics was created, and interestingly, the name eugenics was coined by a cousin of Charles Darwin in England, Sir Francis Galton. This was the so-called science of improving human populations by controlling breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable mental or physical characteristics. And eugenics broke down into positive and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics was encouraging the reproduction among people who had desirable traits. So if you were smart and good-looking and tall, you should marry a woman who was smart and good-looking and tall, and preferably white when it became racist, and have lots of kids that way. And if you were not, that's not a good, we should discourage those people from having children. Negative eugenics, which was the really dark side of eugenics, we should discourage or prevent forcibly the reproduction among people with undesirable traits. prohibit them from getting married, sterilize them, abort them, and ultimately kill them. So there was the positive and there was the negative. The United States was the model for Nazi Germany in terms of the positive and somewhat to the negative eugenics. So it may surprise you to know, in 1907, Indiana was the first state in the United States that mandated sterilization for certain individuals in state custody. Mostly, these are people who had mental illness or people who were called the criminally insane. They had to be sterilized. That was 1907. By the late 1920s, 28 states in the US had followed suit with similar laws. By 1960, about 60,000 people in the US had been sterilized on eugenic grounds, many against their will, and half of this number, interestingly, in California. Mostly these were people who were in jail or people who were in psychiatric hospitals. And then, of course, you had the anti-miscegenation laws in the South, where a black person could not marry or have children with a white person, because this was, again, degrading to the race, mongrelization, as it was called. This was anti-eugenics, so they passed laws. In 1924, American policy followed on eugenics, and they said, you know what? We had too many immigrants from the 1880s, 90s, and 1910s coming from Eastern Europe, Italy, people with darker skin, Africa, Asia. We have to cut down on the immigration, and they passed a very strict immigration law to prevent these people from coming. How many thousands of Jews were prevented from coming to the United States when Hitler came to power because of this law? This law had consequences. It may also ring certain bells about what's going on today. If it hasn't, I'm having you think about that. Adolf Hitler said in his book Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which he wrote when he was in jail after an unsuccessful putsch to try to get rid of the Weimar Republic, there is today one state, the US, in which at least weak beginnings toward a better conception are notable. Of course, it's not our model German Republic, which was the Weimar Republic, which was democratic, but the American Union, in which an effort is made to consult reason, at least partially, by refusing immigration on principle to elements in poor health, by simply excluding certain races from naturalization. It professes in slow beginnings a view which is peculiar to the folkish state concept. So Adolf Hitler looked with admiration to the immigration laws of the United States. Now, lest you think that only kooks and racists and horrible people were eugenicists, look at this list of people. Tell me, did you know that any of these people, would you call them racists, horrible people, awful, stupid? These are the cream of American intelligentsia, politically, academically. Presidents, Margaret Sanger, who is lionized by Planned Parenthood. She was a staunch eugenicist, felt that we should do everything possible to prevent women who were poor or had alcohol problems or mental or physical disabilities. We should do everything to prevent them from having children. The Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., I'll read to him the famous statement he made in the wake of one of the cases that was brought to him. The Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, all supported eugenics. Charles Eliot, president of Harvard, Alexander Graham Bell, Nobel laureate. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because people that we admire, people we think are smart, intelligent, and of course we look back in retrospect and say, how could they have done this? At the time, they felt this was cutting edge. There's a lesson for us. Some of the things that we think today perhaps are cutting edge and moral and ethical and appropriate. 20 years from now, it may not seem so. So this is a list that's worthy of noting. And here is Oliver Wendell Holmes. So Virginia enacted a law requiring the forced sterilization of certain people who were, in this particular case, of Buck v. Bell, it was a young woman who they felt had mental retardation. It turns out that she was poor, she had no education, she wasn't retarded at all, she didn't have intellectual disability, but she didn't pass the test. And so Virginia wanted to sterilize her against her wishes, and they appealed this, and Virginia wanted this to be appealed because it wanted the imprimatur of the Supreme Court that they felt would okay the Virginia law. So it goes to the Supreme Court rules 8-1 in favor of supporting the Virginia law. And Oliver Wendell Holmes states, quote, "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives." He happened to have been wounded 3 times as a soldier in the Civil War, similar to the German soldiers who were killed during World War I. So the state calls upon the best citizens, young men in war, to give their lives for the state. It would be strange, he says, if it couldn't call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices. These people that we're supporting in these mental hospitals, they're sapping our strength. These are good resources. Why shouldn't they also be called upon to give to the state and just not be supported by the state? It would be strange if it couldn't call upon them for lesser sacrifices, namely sterilization, no big deal, often not felt by those concerned, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute the degenerate offspring for crime, so if she was going to have kids, they were obviously going to be criminals, and we'd have to execute them. Better than that, or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, 1927, 8-1. Now, some of these arguments were used by the Germans. The Germans took it one step further, a lot of steps further. They didn't stop at sterilization. They killed people. They killed people, but they used the same logic, which was okay, which was accepted. You saw how many great people felt that this was perfectly okay. Now, the German social Darwinists and racial hygiene. So as I say, the Germans took this many steps further. Alfred Plötz, in 1895, he coined the term racial hygiene, and he founded the German Society of Racial Hygiene in 1904. The German social Darwinists, they feared for the degeneration of the race, of the Volk, because medical care for the weak had begun to destroy the natural struggle for survival. Again, there's that eugenics argument. The poor and the misfits of the world were beginning to multiply faster than the talented and the fit, and they advocated avoid war. We're all on board with that, but particularly avoid war because the finest young men were killed, and this was anti-eugenics. Support only those poor past childbearing age. So, okay, keep them alive, but they can't have any kids, so it's no big deal. They'll die off, and that's the end of their DNA. Avoid medical care for the weak, and the traditional medical care helps the individual, but it endangers the race. And so the Germans took the whole eugenics thing not just for the race of mankind, but specifically for the Aryan race. They took this to a different level. Now, before World War I in Germany, the support for eugenics was really from a liberal and conservative end of the political and academic spectrum. You saw that in the famous names that I showed you of the United States, of supporters of eugenics. After World War I, right-wing activists, this is in Germany, influenced the movement, and this wing was incorporated into the Nazi medical world. In 1920s, German eugenics was seen no longer necessary to improve the human race in general, but to purify and improve the Nordic German race. National Socialism, Nazism, was viewed as the political expression of biologic knowledge. It was the political expression of good science, of good medicine. Nazism was good medicine, was the implementation of good medical principles into practice. The Nazis took over in 1933, January the 30th. Hitler took over and remained in power until May of 1945, 12 years of a nightmare. He was appointed Chancellor of Germany. By the way, he was elected. You know that they were elected. Then, of course, once they were elected, they took over and killed everybody else, killed their opponents. The Nazi reign continued till May 45. From the start, the Nazi regime credited German racial hygienists with providing the biological foundation for the Nazi racial state. Just think about that. This is a political movement that says we are legitimate not just because of ideology, science. We're scientifically correct. These other people, this is unscientific. It's against the laws of nature. Nazi racial policies based on the so-called science of eugenics carried out egregiously unethical acts of negative eugenic policies, negative eugenics, forced sterilization, euthanasia of people that were felt to be genetically defective. And they passed a variety of laws. I don't have to go into these in detail. The law for the protection of German blood and honor. So a Jew could not marry a German, just as a black could not marry a white. In America, a Jew could not marry a German. Again, it was a degradation of the DNA of the Volk. Jews were considered a mongrel race. Jews were a combination of the Negro and the Oriental, whatever that means. The law for the protection of genetic health of the German people, this applied to the Germans. And so before you got married, you had to go to, you had to be tested. And of course, I had to get tested before I got married. I had to get my VDRL to make sure I didn't have syphilis. It's a legitimate a public health measure. The Germans enacted that. But to make sure that the couple was not suffering from venereal disease, but they also checked them for so-called feeble-mindedness, epilepsy, or any other genetic infirmity. So if you had seizure disorder, you could not get married unless you were sterilized before in Germany, based on this law for the protection of genetic health. Now, this is a cartoon that was shown, a drawing in one of the Nazi publications. Nazis had a lot of propaganda. They were experts, by the way, at propaganda. Experts. They had movies. They had a publication. And so there you see Hitler in the upper left, and you see somebody, a caricature of a Jew, a Jewish doctor with the long nose, with the eyeglasses, and you see a whole jumble of humanity. I don't know if you can see it very well, but that thing they're looking at is kind of a sculpture with a lot of human beings all interwoven. Then Hitler bangs on that. The Jewish doctor is appalled. This is the force, and Hitler remodels that, and that from that mass of humanity emerges a strong, tall, muscular, German, Aryan human being. And the German Jewish doctor is no longer in the picture. Sterilization under the Nazis. How did it work? It worked as follows. They had a law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring. And so there were genetic health courts that were set up throughout Germany. These health courts consisted of 2 doctors and 1 lawyer, and they decided whether you were going to be sterilized or not. The eugenic indications, so if I am a doctor and I have a patient who had feeble-mindedness, or I had a patient who had a manic depressive psychosis or epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, etc., genetic blindness, I had to report that person to the genetic health course. I didn't get their permission. There was no confidentiality. It was under the law, I had to report that person to the genetic health court. And if they found that this was correct, they would tell the person they were going to be sterilized. If the person objected, they would send them to a concentration camp. How did they sterilize? Men were sterilized with vasectomy. That was pretty easy. Women had to undergo tubal ligation. They didn't have laparoscopy in those days. You're talking about a significant laparotomy, and there was morbidity to that. There was sometimes mortality. It was not such a simple thing, tying the fallopian tubes. Then they tried injecting carbon dioxide to cause scarring of the fallopian tubes. They tried radiating women who had ended up with terrible burns on their abdomen from the radiation. They were experimenting. What is the most effective and efficient way to sterilize all of these undesirable people? Now, they terminated this program, so about 400,000 Germans were sterilized by the end of the program. They stopped doing it with the onset of World War I because number one, because there weren't that many people left to do so, and number 2, because now they turned to euthanasia, much more effective than just sterilization. And interestingly, at the end of World War II, you may have heard of the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials were set up by the court of the Allied victors in Nuremberg, Germany, and they brought to a trial for war crimes politicians, army people, physicians, lawyers. At the Nuremberg trial of doctors, they did not accuse them of crimes of forced sterilization. Guess why? Because it was happening in their own countries. How could they accuse the Nazi of forced sterilization when it was being done in America, when it was being done in a variety of European countries as well? They did not accuse them of that crime. And here are the other countries with sterilization. The US, 60,000, Switzerland, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Estonia, Iceland, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You see that this was, Sweden sterilized 62,000 people, almost all women, often against their will. Eugenics, it was eugenics. and the laws varied from mere legalization of sterilization to compulsory sterilization. And by the way, it is why today, even when there might be a good cause for sterilizing, let's say it's a real problem. You have a woman, you have your daughter who is sexually mature and physically attractive, but who has severe mental problems and so forth. Do you want her to get pregnant and she will be abused? Sterilization would seem to be not unreasonable. It hardly ever happens because of this legacy, and so other means are sought, birth control means, et cetera, et cetera. So they graduated, the Germans, from sterilization to euthanasia, and Adolf Just in 1895 wrote a book, The Right to Death. The control over the death of an individual, he said, must ultimately belong to the social organism, to the state, to preserve the health of the Volk, the German Volk, the people. The state already possesses that right in war, where thousands of healthy people are sacrificed for the good of the state, as Oliver Wendell Holmes said. Ultimately, a biomedical argument was proposed. The state has to be allowed, has the right to kill in order to keep the social organism alive and healthy. Robert Lifton's book, The Nazi Doctors, very interesting, very, very fascinating reading for those of you who want to take this a little bit further. There was a book written in 1920, I mentioned it before, Life Unworthy of Life, The Permission to Destroy Life Unworthy of Life. It was authored by two distinguished German professors. One was a jurist, the other a psychiatrist. Again, Lebensunwertens, Leben, unworthy life. Who were these? People who were incurably ill, mentally ill, feeble-minded, retarded, deformed children. This was life unworthy of life. And it medicalized the entire concept. The therapeutic goal was a healing treatment. So you weren't only doing the state a favor, you were doing these people a favor. They were suffering. They had mental and physical disabilities. They didn't want to live. They were suffering. We were doing them a favor by killing them. It was a healing treatment. Friedrich Nietzsche stated, the sick person is a parasite of society. They called these people useless eaters, useless eaters. Now, it wasn't only in Germany that you had advocates of euthanasia. In 1935, the French-American Nobel Prize winner, Alexis Carrel, he invented the iron lung. I don't know, how many of you ever heard of the iron lung? You know what oh, wonderful, that's terrific. So you know. I had an iron lung when I was an intern. We had one in Columbia Presbyterian. We were still using them. They were, initially he invented them and saved thousands of lives of kids who had polio because they couldn't breathe. There was a negative pressure kind of machine. So he won the Nobel Prize, and this is what he said. He suggested in his book, Man the Unknown, the criminal and the insane should be, quote, humanely and economically disposed of in small euthanasia institutions supplied with proper gases. Alexis Carrel, Nobel Prize winner, saver of the thousands and thousands of lives. 1937 Gallup poll showed 45% of Americans favored euthanasia for defective infants. 1942, Dr. Foster Kennedy, professor of neurology at Cornell Medical College, he wrote in the Journal of the American Psychiatric Association, he argued for the killing of retarded children ages 5 and older, hopeless ones who should never have been born, nature's mistakes. So it's hard for us to sit here and listen to this, but again, these were people who were respected in the academic, political world, and they weren't considered murderers or horrible people. Yes, there were some people who did consider this wrong and so forth, but the fact that mainstream people could articulate ideas like this, a Nobel Prize winner, and not be considered horrible murderers, shows you something about the influence of the times and how people can be influenced when everybody else is saying this. Maybe my hang-ups about this are wrong. I should get over the hang-ups because this is the way to go. This is where the cream of society is telling us to go. Now, Nazi medical ethics, not all lives are of equal value. Gerhard Wagner, he was the Fuhrer, the leader of the Doctors' League, the Nazi Doctors' League, and he attacked liberalism and Marxism for denying, quote, the inherently different value of different individuals. Liberalism led one to value the sick, the dying, and the unfit on a par with the healthy and the strong. And that was wrong, he said. Contrast this with a saying in the Talmud, he who saves one life is as if he saves an entire universe. He who destroys one life is as if he destroys an entire universe. It doesn't say he who saves one life of somebody who has no mental or physical disabilities. Life is life. And the euthanasia program, Dr. Leo Alexander wrote an article in in the New England Journal of Medicine. He was one of the American doctors who testified at the Nuremberg trials. He said, the beginnings at first were merely a subtle shift in emphasis in the basic attitudes of physicians. It started with the acceptance that there is such a thing as a life not worthy to be lived. Gradually, the sphere of those to be included in this category was enlarged. It was no longer just the mental and physically disabled, but it was people of other races who were a plague on society. Now, the Nazi euthanasia program started right after World War II. World War II started with the invasion of Poland in September 1939. The euthanasia program started the next month in October. It was never authorized by a law, but Hitler had a written decree authorizing it. It began with kids, with killing deformed and mentally retarded children. These were kids who were basically in institutions already. It was administered by a committee, just like the Committee for Sterilization. They had a tribunal of 3 people for the scientific, quote-unquote, treatment of severe genetically determined illness. So if you were a midwife or a doctor, an obstetrician, and you delivered a child that was born with a congenital abnormality, you had to register that child with the local health authorities. And the doctors who were caring for kids up to the age of 3, if they saw in their practice a child with a mental or physical disability or seizure disorder, they had to report them. And there was a form that they filled out, a piece of paper I'll show you in a minute. It was returned by doctors and midwives who evaluated whether or not these children should be killed, 2 pediatricians and 1 psychiatrist. The children who were slated to die had an X placed at the lower left-hand corner of the sheet, and those who were spared was a minus sign. Most of them got pluses. And the decision was based solely on the questionnaire. The court never even examined the kids. And here's the piece of paper, and you see on the lower left-hand corner, you see a plus. This is the form, 1 page to determine whether this child is to be executed or not. The children who were selected, and that's the term that they used. Notice again how to make it scientific. What was Darwin? Natural selection. This was human selection. They were sent to one of 28 institutions, mostly hospitals, which were equipped with killing facilities. And I was in one of these killing facilities. It's a museum today, and I'll show you pictures of it in a moment. Parents were told that their children were being sent for improved treatment into one of these facilities. How did they kill the children? Injected morphine, oral barbiturates, or gassed them with cyanide or carbon monoxide. Sometimes the children were starved, so their deaths could be natural. And they would get pneumonia and so forth and die in this way. The parents were then informed with a standardized letter that the children had died suddenly and unexpectedly of brain edema, appendicitis, pneumonia, or other fabricated illnesses. Because of the danger of an epidemic, it said the body had to be cremated immediately. So the parents were returned ashes. Sometimes they were not even necessarily the ashes of their own children. Now, this spread then to adult euthanasia as well. And this again, remember folks, this is not the Jews. This is the Germans doing this to the Germans. It started that way. The first adult victims were 4,400 incurably mentally ill patients from a Polish insane asylum who were simply shot when the Germans invaded Poland. In January 1940, the first large-scale test of adult euthanasia of German patients occurred in Brandenburg Psychiatric Hospital. It was the first time that a shower facility was used into which the patients were led by doctors wearing white coats. We talked about trust of patients. So when you take an adult and you have a doctor in a white coat with a stethoscope hanging out, come with me, we are going to take care of you. And they walk, they don't want any fighting and any agitation. So the doctors accompanied the patients into the shower room where they were going to be disinfected, locked the door, and then carbon monoxide came from the shower heads, and they were all dead. The bodies were then cremated. The ultimate abuse of physician authority, using the trust that people had in doctors to lead them into the shower rooms. The bodies were cremated after the gold fillings were removed. Gassings were administered by a physician. The Nazis wanted the doctors to do the whole job, all the dirty work, because this wasn't dirty work, it was clean work. It was medicine, it was scientific. They had to delude themselves into thinking what they were doing was not absolute murder. And Brandenburg was the model for the disinfection elsewhere. Now, ultimately, relatives of these people began to become suspicious because they would get a letter saying your loved one died of appendicitis, but they had had their appendix taken out 10 years earlier. And people, and word started to get around, and people who lived around the hospitals, like in Hotel Dieu, right in the middle of the town, these hospitals and killing facilities were right in the middle of Berlin and surrounding areas. So people started to get, they noted that there would be buses of people coming at the hospital, and hours later there was smoke coming out of these chimneys. What was going on? So there was minimal and some resistance on the part of psychiatrists. This is just a picture of one of the women who was sent to her death, a woman with some sort of mental abnormality. And the justification then for euthanasia was as follows, and this is important because this shows you that there was this rationale. It wasn't just plain bloody murder. There was a biologic need to preserve the health of the Volk. There were economic reasons. Germany was in a war fighting for its life, and so caring for the mentally and physically ill was expensive and a drain on the economy, especially in a time of war. Euthanizing these patients would free up doctors, hospital beds, and food that was needed for the war effort. The best and the brightest of German men were dying in battle for the good of the state. Therefore, it was the duty of the infirm also to give up their lives. And a humanitarian reason, relieving the physically and mentally ill of their suffering and relieve their parents of the burden of their care. 5 good reasons to do the euthanasia. This is just another propaganda sign that showed the German people bearing the yoke of having to support people. You see them displaying people with mental and physical disabilities in a horrendous way, but they want, are you sharing the load? A genetically ill individual costs about 50,000 Reichsmarks by the age of 60, therefore it's good to get rid of them. There was some opposition to the euthanasia program eventually, and so what Lifton says, what eventually persuaded Nazi leaders to cancel the project was not psychiatric resistance, but rather general resistance among the German people when they found out about this, and it was articulated by a few courageous Protestant and Catholic religious leaders. Of note, there was virtually no religious leader protestation against the mass murder of the Jews, but they did protest against the murder of their fellow German citizens. 70,000 patients were murdered. The program went on officially, was stopped August of 1941. Gas chambers were in 6 centers, and the killings continued. Just because they stopped the actual killing in the gas chambers, they still, in an unofficial way, hundreds of thousands of more people died, but naturally. They just starved them to death. They would not treat them when they got pneumonia, and so they were allowed to die even after the actual gassings stopped. Now, just so you know, again, the Nazi doctors were, I told you, they were the cream of the crop. They had some wonderful public health programs. Nazi medicine advised marital counseling, obligatory reporting of venereal disease, discouraging smoking and alcohol use. It was in Nazi Germany that the link between cancer and smoking was first, not in the 1964 Surgeon General report in the United States. The Nazi doctors brought this up earlier. Preventive medicine, mass X-ray screening for cancer and TB, screening for occupationally related disease, encouraging organic foods. This book, The Nazi War on Cancer, fascinating book. There was a lot of good in Nazi medicine, and I bring this up to you to show you that they were not just bloodthirsty animals. These were sophisticated, scientifically grounded physicians who came up with some terrific ideas. I tell you this to show you that even people with good ideas and good credentials can be immoral, can do horrible things. And just because somebody is a professor of medicine doesn't mean that they're a moral person. They are, and I'm a professor of medicine, so I can say that. So that's important for us to know. Teaching medical ethics under the Nazis, they had courses in medical ethics during Nazi Germany. They taught them that only Aryan doctors were good doctors. The duty of disclosure instead of confidentiality. Don't listen to the Hippocratic Oath, which says that you have to keep confidentiality. For the good of your society, you have to report these people to the courts, which will then either sterilize them or euthanize them. The euthanasia of the disabled and hereditary illnesses is a burden for the Volk, and so on. This is a great quote. If you want to read an interesting article, Dr. Sherwin Nuland, who is a surgeon at Yale, who has passed away a couple of years ago, he wrote a couple of excellent books, a real humanitarian, and he reviewed The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. had an exhibit, Deadly Medicine. And he wrote an article in the New Republic in 2004 in which he went through this exhibit, and he ended up by saying the following: "To my startled dismay, I found myself understanding why so much of the German medical establishment acted as it did. I realized that given the circumstances, I might have done the same." He's bearing his soul. He's saying, I understand how these people could do it. I might have done the same if I were in that society and subject to the same societal influences, etc. And this is a lesson for all of us to keep in mind. Now, then you jump from the murder of German children and adults, then you go to the Holocaust, to the mass murder of Jews, and included homosexuals, gypsy people, many Poles as well. The so-called Jewish problem was viewed as a medical problem. How could they justify killing all these Jews? This was a medical problem because the Jews were considered carriers of disease, a mongrel nation, and were really considered as subhuman bacteria. The German medical and political elite, they medicalized various forms of social, sexual, political, or racial deviance. Jews, gay persons, Romani, which are gypsies, Marxists, and other groups were typecast. These were health hazards to the German population. So, the extermination of these groups was viewed as a legitimate public health measure. It wasn't done because we hate Jews and they're awful people. This was necessary as like you get rid of rats. You had to get rid of the Jews because they posed a health to public health. So this was the eradication of disease-spreading bacteria, rodents, or insects. And to show you again the medicalization of the Nazi regime, here is a picture in a book. Adolf Hitler, what is he called? He's called als Arzt des deutschen Volk, the doctor, Adolf Hitler, doctor of the German people. Adolf Hitler, remember, it was the political realization of biologic and medical acts. That's what Nazi Germany was depicted as to itself and to its people. Here is a quote from Adolf Hitler from a book. "Countless illnesses are caused by one bacillus, the Jews. We will become healthy when we eliminate the Jews." So the Jews are graded not just to rodents, but to actually bacteria. Now look at this. This is taken from one of the Nazi propaganda leaflets. This is an amazing slide. I hope you can see this. Here you have a microscope, and there you see the circle on the upper portion. It shows you what you see in the microscope. What's under there? Not E. coli, not Pseudomonas, Jewish stars. Jewish stars. The Jews are depicted as the bacteria. In addition to the Jewish stars, you see the hammer and sickle, so that communists are in there. You see the triangle, which represents homosexuals. So this tells it all. This tells it all. When you can make subhuman bacteria human beings, then their eradication becomes medically necessary as a public health measure. And here again, some of the others showing the Star of David on a spider, and it entraps in its web just the regular people. And here you have an exterminator. The oak is the oak tree of the German people, and you can't read it, but on the branches of the tree it has great names, Beethoven and Heinrich Heine, etc., the great people. And this tree is being eroded by rodents and rats, and the exterminator is getting rid of them. You see the swastika on his shoulder, on his arm, and of course these are the Jews that are going to destroy the great German oak. This is the gas chamber in Bernburg Hospital. Looks like a very clean and lovely place. You see the shower head on top. This is the actual gas chamber which we were taken to in the course of our time there. This is the peephole through which the doctors looked to see when the people were all dead, so that they can open up the door and they can then get rid of the carbon monoxide. This is the woman. Our tour leader was the lady on the left. The translator was the lady in the middle, and one of the people on the tour was this gentleman with the baseball cap. And this is the adjacent, this is where they burned the bodies. This is the crematorium in the hospital. This was all in the hospital. Now, practice makes perfect. The experience that was gained from, it was called the T4 program because the address in Berlin was Tiergartenstrasse 4. The experience that the Germans gained from killing their own people in these euthanasia programs was invaluable in perfecting their techniques for mass murder. Many of the very same doctors and nurses who were decommissioned from their duties in the T4 program, they then were sent east to Poland, to the newly constructed death camps in Poland, of which Auschwitz was the largest. And of course, you know, Auschwitz had these huge gas chambers where they could fit as many as 1,000 people at a time and kill them. Same technique, but instead of using carbon monoxide, they used a cyclone B gas. They applied the knowledge that was derived from the T4 campaign in carrying out the ultimate program of racial hygiene by murdering millions of innocent human beings, mostly Jews, but also Poles, homosexuals, Romani in gas chambers. The whole issue of medical experimentation is another vast area of the degradation of the medical profession. This was carried out on a massive scale against the wishes of the patients, of course. This was carried out by prestigious physicians. These were good physicians, many of whom have their names attached to illnesses today, the Reiter syndrome and other syndromes where their names are attached to diseases that they discovered. Many of these people were commissioned by the army for purposes of treating troops in dire circumstances. So the Germans wanted to know, how can we save our German pilots when they have to ditch their planes in the North Atlantic in the frigid waters of the North Sea? So they took Jews, put them in tubs with ice water, and they did physiologic measurements of it, how long it took for them to die, how could we counteract this, and so on. How could we apply this information to try to save the German doctors? They injected people with typhus and with malaria and tried out various antibiotics. Instead of using animals, they used humans. The ethical justification, these people were slated for death anyway, so why don't we make use of them and get some scientific knowledge from them? Why not use them for information that can save thousands of lives? It's interesting how people could go to sleep at night after done these things and have some ethical justification. People don't go to bed at night saying, what I just did was horrible, I'm a murderer. That of course, this was appropriate, this was necessary. This was even for the good of humanity. If I get a cure for typhus, think of all the people I could save. So it's worthwhile. The slippery slope. It started with applied eugenics, then the sterilization law, then the Nuremberg Laws, child euthanasia, adult euthanasia, medical experiments, and the final solution. Are there lessons to be learned? So here's a touchy area. Whenever I give this talk, I'm sure that there are people in the audience who may be, for example, if you want to just look at assisted suicide or aid in dying and euthanasia today and say, Dr. Prager, don't you dare bring this up. We are not Nazi doctors who are in favor of this. And I agree, of course not. They are as ethical as I am. They are good people. They are humane. They feel very strongly that these are appropriate things. But nevertheless, I think that it's important for us to look at this experience and to see maybe there might be some application, maybe something that we can learn. We certainly don't want to replicate any of these horrors. So can anything be learned from this history? Does the fact that today people who, and I'm just using assisted suicide and euthanasia, the fact that it's voluntary consent, does that mean that we can't make any kind of comparison or we cannot learn any lessons? So there are some lessons, though, I think we have to look at. Number one, the ease with which the highest medical ideals can be violated. You see that. You see that happen. And again, this happened in sophisticated and technologically advanced people. The technological and scientific excellence of academic physicians, it does nothing to immunize them to the worst perversion of medical ethics. Intelligence and professional achievement are unrelated to moral behavior. You can be an unlettered, illiterate peasant and be on a moral plane that is miles above that of a tenured professor in an academic institution. One has nothing to do with the other. That's an important fact to keep in mind, because sometimes we take our morals and ethics from the people who have the credentials, and I don't know that that's appropriate, and you see how it certainly wasn't so in Nazi Germany. Once the threshold is crossed of accepting legally and ethically the intentional taking of life requested by the patient, and aided or carried out by the physician, the likelihood of a slippery slope is great. The more the intentional taking of life becomes acceptable, the more society will become comfortable with physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, and the easier it will be to extend the criteria for such actions. So, for example, in Oregon, which was the first state in the United States which legalized assisted suicide, they said this could only be done for terminally ill patients. Now they want to, which means that they have less than 6 months to live based on the doctor's best guess. Now they want to extend that. Somebody with a chronic illness who is suffering, who autonomously says, I don't want to live like this anymore, they want to get rid of the 6 month. How about this? The fact that in Canada, here in Canada, correct me if I'm wrong, that your law now for euthanasia says that in order for euthanasia to be legally carried out, the person has to be of sound mind at the time of the euthanasia. Well, that discriminates against people who will develop dementia. If I, in my sound mind now, say, I was just diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I know what happens. I write in an advance directive, when I get to the point where I can no longer speak and recognize my family and I'm incontinent, I want to be euthanized. Why should that person be deprived of their autonomous rights simply because they lack capacity at that point? And you see that compelling arguments can be made. In the United States, all of the states that legalize assisted suicide mean that you have to be able to take the pills yourself. But what if the person is paralyzed by cancer and they can't take it? Why should they be discriminated against? Why shouldn't the doctor be allowed to administer the lethal potion? So you see how this thing can easily slide. The slippery slope in euthanasia from voluntary adult, involuntary meaning that the patient lacks capacity, and they do euthanize people in Netherlands, in Belgium today, who lack capacity, who have such advanced directives. Voluntary child euthanasia, involuntary child euthanasia, the Groningen Protocol, and then euthanasia for severe physical suffering, and people are now being euthanized who have refractory depression and who are suffering, and for mental reasons as well. Life unworthy of the rise of an absolutist view of patient autonomy, that trumps everything in many medical and philosophical circles, as well as the body politic of some European countries, Canada, 9 US states, has reintroduced the notion of a life unworthy of life as determined by patients and not the state. Now you may say, but that makes all the difference, and others may say, maybe it doesn't make all the difference. Does the voluntary consent of a patient mark such a profound difference between then and now that any attempt at comparison is offensive? So we have seen how the synergy of economic depression, cataclysmic war, an ideology of lives unworthy of living, and the science, so-called, of eugenics may have explained the horrors of Nazi medicine. So once assisted suicide and its likely offspring euthanasia become increasingly accepted in the US, how might the cost of caring for an impending tidal wave of aging baby boomers interact with an increasingly stressed healthcare budget to broaden the scope of assisted suicide and make it not only acceptable but desirable? Might voluntary consent be influenced by fiscal realities? Might the right to PAS become an obligation? When more people are doing it, somebody who is dying, has a chronic illness, feels selfish for not electing assisted suicide or euthanasia. I don't want to use up my resources. I want it to be for my kids. I'm useless now. It's a useless life. I'm a useless eater. Euthanize. Maybe that's the way to go. The discussion of legalizing euthanasia has effects on the will to live. This is from actually one of the German books, Cleansing the Fatherland, and on social estimates of the value of the life of the seriously ill and handicapped. Support for relaxation of the law increases conspicuously in times of economic crisis. The fact, I think yesterday one of the speakers said, the fact that it's even discussed now is something that changes the whole balance. Before that, it was totally out of your mind. Death wishes depend upon material conditions as well as upon whether a society classifies suffering and death as superfluous misery. The Nazi campaign against worthless life created its own demand. And finishing up here, why should an increase in assisted suicide matter as long as it's involuntary? Will this affect the moral fabric of our society, and who determines what is moral? Is the notion of the sanctity of life merely an outdated religious value? You say something like the sanctity of life and people start to cringe. Some people start to cringe. This whole notion of sanctity, that's religious, you're far out, right to life people, I don't want to hear that. Will the increasing secularization of Western society have implications for what is considered ethical medical practice? Great quote from Dostoevsky, the brothers Karamazov, if there is no God, then all is permitted. Once the intentional taking of life by physicians is accepted, will there be unanticipated consequences? Will it weaken medicine's commitment to patients in situations of societal stressors. So I conclude with the same picture that you had yesterday at the beginning of your talk. I love this talk. I don't love the talk because it's horrible material, but I love the picture because it really captures the essence of the humanism of physicians and so forth. So with that rather negative message to you, but I hope there are lessons to be learned, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your talk. It was amazing, and I commend your courage because, in my experience, anybody who compares any current trend to the Nazis immediately gets branded as an extremist and as a, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I and several other people in this room have been working since before the Canadian Euthanasia law to try to stop it from happening, which, can you hear me? No.
I have a hearing problem, so if you speak loud, that would help.
I and several colleagues in this room, we're working since before the Canadian Euthanasia law to try to stop it from happening. And we continue to try to stop it from spreading. And so far we've had a lot of bad news over the years. So this is not really a question, I just wanted to give you a tiny bit of good news, which is that the World Medical Association is meeting right now in Tbilisi, Georgia, which I had to look up on the map, but it's part of the old USSR. And a year ago, the Canadian Medical Association was trying to get the WMA, which is a federation of all the different national medical associations, to take a neutral stance on euthanasia and assisted suicide. And to our shame, because that's our medical association, but when they first tried a year ago, there was so much resistance that they had to withdraw the proposal, but the debate was not solved, and several Canadian colleagues of ours who did not agree with the CMA actually went to the meeting last year and again 6 months ago and are there now to explain to delegates from all over the world what's happening in Canada and that it's not as rosy as the CMA says it is. And I just heard yesterday that the WMA reaffirmed very, very clearly in no uncertain terms its opposition to euthanasia and assisted suicide. And so I just thought I would share that.
Well, I congratulate you for your efforts and hope you continue to do well and succeed in what you are aiming for. Thank you. Yeah, the other thing is I would never compare the physicians who are pro-assisted suicide to Nazis. I would not do that, and I think it is wrong. It is wrong. They are not Nazis. And there is a huge difference between people who are suffering and autonomously wish to be put to death and doing this and murdering people who don't want to be. I think that's a very fundamental issue. My feelings, I think you've gotten from my talk, but I think we have to be very careful about that because once we start saying things like this is like Nazis, you're going to be discredited, you're crazy, you're a fringe person. And I think you have to talk about the unintended consequences, the fear, as I say, about economic reasons for having this occur. And these are legitimate. So I think that's a word of caution that we all have to be aware of.
So in fact, in Canada, what happened was our courts forced this upon us. The Canadian Parliament had voted overwhelmingly against instituting this euthanasia law several months before the court decision, and in fact the Supreme Court had previously ruled that this was unconstitutional like 10 years ago. So the question is now, the courts are sort of making these moral decisions, and I don't know where we go from there. So morality is now put off to lawyers. I don't know where that's going to lead us.
No, I think the question of who has the final say, whether it's the representatives of the people in the parliament or whether it's courts, which is a far smaller group of people, is a very fundamental question of governance of your society. And I think that has to be dealt with in the most basic way. Who has the final say? It would seem to be that the people should. That's the whole point of legislation. They ought to be able to legislate against it, but that's a societal decision. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. Maybe I'll move to the other spectrum. I'm a pediatric neurologist, and we deal in our center with prenatal diagnosis. Would you consider prenatal diagnosis and testing, in your view, is it, as you know, in the United States, as in Canada, we have screening programs for prenatal testing of trisomy 21. And pretty soon, trisomy 21,
yeah.
And pretty soon there will be non-invasive prenatal testing that will be going on.
Yeah.
How do you consider these programs? I mean, can they be considered a form of negative eugenics?
Well, I think clearly it is a form of negative eugenics, but does that mean that it's wrong? Look, speaking from the point of view in the United States, where abortion still is legal, although it's obviously being challenged in many states, if people can do it for no reason well, there's always a reason, obviously. I don't belittle the choice of a woman to have an abortion. But if a woman can do it because this would be undesirable at this point in my life with a healthy fetus, it seems to me difficult to legislate against somebody doing it for, we don't want to have a child. We do want to have a child, but a child with a devastating neurologic or congenital defect we don't want to have. I think if you're asking me my own opinion, or you're asking me from the point of view of the law, I think that people do have that right. Look, people have the right also not to keep alive a child, and Elvira can attest to this more than I can, a child with severe congenital anomalies that they feel has a very limited expectancy and might be suffering, and they don't want to support the life of that child. So because it's prenatal, does that make it any more immoral than if you let the child die and don't support them after the child is born? I don't have a clear-cut answer for you. I think you're right. I think it is a form of negative, if you will, eugenics. Eugenics obviously has a dirty name now as a result of what the Nazis did. But having said that, I don't think that we have to say that it's moral to try and bring every single fetus to life, even those that may have the most horrendous types of congenital anomalies. I think there are some that are incompatible with life more than a very short time that may lead to the child suffering, and we view that as acceptable. Where you draw the line, I think that should be really up to, I think that's a parental decision. I don't put that in the same category as after the child is born, forcefully taking the life of a baby. So it's a very sensitive issue, I agree with you, but I think just because you can view that as negative eugenics does not automatically mean that we should have absolutely no say in electing to continue a pregnancy of a child who may have a severe anomaly.
Thank you. I just wanted to share with you that 23 years ago I had an unplanned pregnancy while I was living in Germany. And while I was there, and maybe you know this, that when you are pregnant, you receive a Mutterpass. And this passport was created by Hitler and the doctors. And today you still get this Mutterpass. And it's part of the health controlling of and monitoring of your pregnancy and how healthy your baby will be. And it's made me very nervous, this process. And you can see in public health how the intentions are very good, but this is something that's still into practice where all of your tests, you have to come with your Mutterpass and you make sure you have everything on it and that you've had all of your tests and your blood work and everything is on it. In the prenatal screening, I came up with blood work, which happens quite often, that I had a higher risk of having a Down syndrome and a spina bifida baby. They thought, oh, you have now 1 in 300 chance of having a baby that would be this. So there was a tremendous amount of pressure for me to actually terminate my pregnancy as a result. And in looking at my race, they would look at me and say, what is your background? What is your race? So I just wanted to share with you that even today, some of it's a very slippery slope, that I think that there's a subtle pressure in society that one has to be observant of as a healthcare practitioner. What is going on and how we conduct that. But even today, you have this mutapass.
You know, I think as our technology evolves and as we have greater information about what kind of a baby a woman may give birth to and so forth, there are going to be some very difficult questions over here. And I don't think, just as I implied before, that it's just a blanket approach that allowing every birth to proceed and every child, with no matter how severe the anomaly, to continue. I don't think that that's necessarily the response to the horrible evils that I spoke about over here. It's much more nuanced. I think it is more nuanced. And I think there are legitimate issues of suffering, of resource allocation sometimes that really have to be faced. I think these are very difficult problems. And I think, so I therefore, I don't think the proper response to this is that all, that they're not anybody who would consider screening prenatally for these congenital anomalies and so forth as a Nazi doctor. It's much more nuanced than that. These were obviously egregious violations. We have to keep that in mind. But to say the other extreme, that it absolutely matters not at all, personally, I don't think that that's necessarily the right approach or the accepted approach.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I'm a palliative care doctor in Baltimore, Maryland, and right now there is the initiative to get physician-assisted suicide legal in Maryland. And I was in a meeting among palliative care clinicians, and one of them told a story that she's seated in this hearing, I don't know the word, but anyway, where there were people in favor and people against, and the argument of the people in favor was mostly people that had negative experiences with death. And I was kind of talking among friends, and I told them, but I have seen beautiful things in my patients, in my experience. I see them grow. I see things that I think if they don't go through all this trouble or suffering, they will not have grow as a human being and flourish in the way that I cannot even describe very well. And this person told me, yeah, but you cannot convince someone that had a negative experience with your positive experience. So I just wanted to hear your comments about this argument. That's my first question. Second question, another argument is that, we cannot palliate everything. So I'm a palliative care doctor, so we cannot palliate spiritual pain, and like, so I don't know.
Okay, my answer, or at least my comments on your first, I went down to Trenton, New Jersey when they were considering assisted suicide, legalizing in New Jersey, which they ultimately did. But all of the people testifying for the bill were people who spoke anecdotally of their own experiences with their husbands, their wives, and so on. I don't think that's how you make policy for a country, based on bad experiences of individuals. And I think we should be putting our resources into better palliative care so that some of these cases need not have died like that if they had had adequate palliative care. The other thing is, I think, yes, I'll come back to that principle that we can't have the perfect solution. Everybody can't be happy, which will cause the greater harm to society as a whole. And yes, we cannot palliate everybody. Obviously, we can do terminal palliation in people with intractable pain and so forth, but I think the consequences of legalizing this on the basis of a relatively select small number of people and having this applied society-wide is wrong. I think that the unintended consequences for society of a whole far outweigh the injustices and the wrongs to the individuals who may suffer because we don't legalize assisted suicide.
I'd like to thank you for this wonderful talk. Thank you very much. It was really informative. I have two questions or comments I'd like you to comment or to answer to. The one is about unintended negative impact of having a new law, physician-assisted suicide, whatever, the way we have in Canada. One of them is that more and more now, it didn't take long, maybe 1 or 2 years before there would be a form of stigmatization of the doctors who would not participate, were resisting a little. They would be stigmatized more and more as people insensitive to other people's suffering. And we can hear this more and more, and even to the point that I would not be surprised that within a few years, the doctors who would still hold their position in front of it would be prosecuted or whatever. I mean, I can see the seeds of that right now as a negative consequence of this shift in terms of mentality in the medical profession, not to allow someone to suffer. Because as we said, palliative sometimes cannot be the answer for every single case. We know that. So that's one thing I can see. I can see the installation of that right now, and I believe that people in hospitals and even in the palliative care houses now are getting denounced by other doctors for letting people suffer. So it's really disturbing in a sense. The other point I'd like you to comment is that if I understood well your talk, I mean, there is such a thing as a slippery slope, and almost a logical slippery slope, because if what you offer as a solution to suffering, would that be assisted suicide or euthanasia, if it is a good, if it is a right or a good, because for us it's within the law, it's a right as well, then that would be discrimination not to offer it to everybody. And when I was involved more or less intensely 4 or 5 years ago with the battle in order not to let this new legislation come in, I was warning people, be careful, because there will be a slope for sure that will tend to that. And they told us that we were conspirationist or whatever, paranoid. And I can feel in the German experience, if we dare to compare ourselves to the German experience, that there are some mechanism built into such a logic that whenever you start to offer something as a deliverance, as something scientific, as something humane, that it's impossible to deny it on long term to everybody. I'd like you to comment on that, please.
Well, first of all, it sounds like you folks are in more trouble than we are in the States, at least in New York. New York, I mean, it's inconceivable. We don't see this argument that you're immune to suffering and you're a terrible doctor and so forth, and pressure like that. I have not seen that. I get more ethics consults, frankly, from physicians who feel that the patient's suffering because the family won't let go, and they are futilely being kept alive in the ICU with no chance of survival, and their bodies are just decomposing, essentially. That I get that much more than not expediting or removing support when it should be support. So I don't, this is a societal thing. Look, if you go to Belgium, you go to Netherlands, where this is much more rampant, really, ask the average Netherlands person. I suspect they're fine with, I suspect that not all of them, but many are just fine, and the doctors are just fine with this, and expanding this to people who have, it's a societal thing, and societal values will change. I can see people, if you feel this pressure of embarking as a physician on civil disobedience and saying, look, this is such a profound distortion of my values, I refuse to comply with this and I will suffer the consequences. I mean, people will have that option. I hope it never gets to that. I think that's a nightmare. But I do believe in the slippery slope, no question about it. I think it's definitely going to happen. What you said, what I said, that why should I discriminate against somebody who's paralyzed, who can't take the pills themselves? There's going to be a court a case of somebody who will say, or the family will say, my wife is quadriplegic from metastatic breast cancer. She can't avail herself of assisted suicide because she can't take the pill herself. Why should she be discriminated against just because her disease is even worse? And societal values. Look, the one thing that this talk tells you about is that there's always reasons. I mean, people will have justification. So the justification for these doctors is, this is terrible suffering. You're a callous doctor. I'm sure there were doctors in Nazi Germany who had hang-ups about doing what they were, and other people telling them, what are you talking about? The Jews are parasites, etc. You're against public health measures? What's the matter with you? So you can have perversions of ideas and values, and it's a societal thing. If society is going down that route, it's going to be a big problem. I don't have a good answer for that. We live in a democracy. If everybody decides to do this and they think that you're the bad guy for allowing people to quote unquote suffer, you have a challenge. The only way you can, I think, deal with that is trying to convince people that is the wrong way to go.
Can I interject, because we have only a few minutes? I do want to ask you a question. Sorry, I have the power. We are not in democracy. No. First of all, I want to thank you, because this is chilling stuff, but I like to hear it because I don't want to fall in the same situation. And in fact, you mentioned someone, I didn't write the name, that who said I would have maybe done the same at that time. And so my question for you is, how can we not do the same? Like, how do you live your profession as a physician, and how do you suggest me and us to live in our society with our patients, with whatever is happening, to not fall to the same mistake?
Yeah. So this is a very fundamental question, and here's where I think it gets tricky. My personal feeling is that the quote from Dostoevsky is really right. When there is no God, all is permitted. I haven't heard a strong secular defense against assisted suicide and euthanasia. I hear it from the religious people who feel all life is sacred, people are created in the image of God. And I'm sure that there are secular people out there who say, oh, that's nonsense, you don't need God in order to do this. But from the point of view of actuality, I think that the strongest defense against falling into that is a strong belief in the sanctity of life. Okay, and I use that word advisedly. You want to say value of life, whatever, because I don't have a good argument other than that. Now, does that mean that you have to be, and I don't mean that you have to be a holy roller type of religious person and so on. I think it means that you have to feel that life is sacred, and you tamper, and having said that, I think it's legitimate and okay to remove unwanted life support in somebody who is dying. I am pro that. I also personally am not against outlawing abortion in the United States, because I think what that will do is it will harm the poorest women who will end up dying because of that is a reality. I think it's so I would challenge the people who don't believe in the sanctity of life or the sacred life. Give me a good argument against expanding assisted suicide and euthanasia, when suffering and autonomy are the only two criteria for doing that. Give me a good argument. And I think it does come down to that. In fact, in Germany, it was the pastor who spoke out against the euthanasia. They didn't extend it to the Jews, unfortunately, but they spoke out against it, and the Nazis were worried about a popular uprising once the churches got on board and said, this is wrong, this is wrong. So how can we, I think the type of people that are gathered here and your ideologies and your feelings is the biggest bulwark, frankly. The people who are against eugenics, mostly in the United States, it was the Catholic Church. And there was a very good book written about, In the Image of God is the name of the book, how the Catholic Church opposed eugenics for sterilization. So that's where I'm coming from. That's where I'm coming from.
Thank you so much. I think, yeah.